Grab your aspirin. Today I'm going to make your head hurt a little. The Federal Reserve is an organization shrouded in secrecy. But the funny thing is, they put everything that you need to know to understand it out in the open. That doesn't mean that the information is easy to decode. It isn't. And the reason is that they obfuscate through the propagation of incorrect definitions and unsound premises. Any system can be logically consistent so long as the definitions and premises are not contradicted. However, faulty conclusions can be drawn if the definitions and premises are false. As Ayn Rand once said, there are no contradictions. If you think you've found one, check your assumptions. And so I come to you today to challenge one of the most basic assumptions, and that is, what is money? Let's start by taking a look at a section from one of the most recent Federal Reserve statistical releases. Yes, it's right out there in the open, so you can go find it for yourself if you like. What I'm showing you here is Table 7, a summary of collateral held against Federal Reserve notes. Now let's think about the significance of just the title of the table, Collateral Held Against Federal Reserve Notes. What is the definition of collateral? If we look the term up in Webster's dictionary, it reads, property pledged by a borrower to protect the interests of the lender. So right away we're faced with a contradiction. Most people think of Federal Reserve notes as money, but it says right here in this official Federal Reserve report that the Federal Reserve has pledged collateral against these notes. Again, there are no contradictions. We must check our premises. The only logical explanation is that the Federal Reserve notes are a credit obligation of the Federal Reserve System, hence why they show up on the liability side of their balance sheet and why they are called notes. But what is it that they have lent? It's at this point that we have to acknowledge that the Federal Reserve works hand in hand with the U.S. government. Federal Reserve notes are created when the U.S. government runs deficits that are higher than the private sector is willing to finance through the purchase of Treasury bonds. The Fed comes in, buys the excess bonds, and issues new Federal Reserve notes. The bonds reside on the Federal Reserve's asset register, while the Federal Reserve notes are spent by the government. Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, coupled with the 16th Amendment of the Constitution, then backs this debt by the taxing power of the government. Thus, these Federal Reserve notes are a lien against the future productivity of U.S. citizens and businesses. The Federal Reserve has enabled the U.S. government to borrow current spending power, and the Federal Reserve note represents the debt to be collected at some time in the future. So the note is a claim on you. But full faith and credit aside, it still needs to be collateralized with something other than faith. And what we see here lists what that backing consists of. Let's explore this further. Here is a simplified version of the collateral account shown on the Federal Reserve statistical release. On the very top is the total amount of Federal Reserve notes outstanding that need to be collateralized. It's about 1.66 trillion. We call them dollars, but in reality they are not dollars in the strictest sense because the Coinage Acts of 1792, 1834, 1857, and 1873 define the dollar as a specific weight of precious metal. The Federal Reserve notes are no such thing. I'm going to attempt to avoid using dollars for the remainder of this video. If I slip, please know that I mean Federal Reserve notes. Beneath this first line are three different types of collateral. The first line is the gold certificate account. These certificates were created in 1934 with the passage of the Gold Reserve Act. I discussed these gold certificates in length in my Architects series of videos, so I won't go through the details here, but you can certainly go back and review those videos if you want more detail. Suffice it to say, they are a claim upon 261 million ounces of physical gold held by the Treasury. They are recorded on the ledger with a book value of 42.22 Federal Reserve notes per ounce. This is not the current market value, only the book value recorded in the early 1970s. So the value shown on the balance sheet of this gold is roughly 11 billion Federal Reserve notes. Next on the ledger are special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund. Unlike the gold certificates, these are marked to market and have a value of a little over 5 billion Federal Reserve notes in total. Finally, we have Treasury, agency, and mortgage-backed securities. The Federal Reserve lists these as being worth a little over 1.6 trillion Federal Reserve notes. Notice that when we add up the value carried on the books for the gold certificates, SDRs, and debt securities, it adds up precisely to the number of Federal Reserve notes. How nice. But we should immediately call BS on this table. While it is mathematically correct according to the definitions used, the definitions used are quite bad and misleading. Consider that the debt securities, when they come due, are payable in Federal Reserve notes. So how can an instrument that is payable in Federal Reserve notes be considered collateral for the Federal Reserve notes? Answer: it can't. All this is an attempt to obfuscate the definition of money. By using the Federal Reserve note as the unit of account on the balance sheet, the Federal Reserve can hide a very important truth, namely, what money is. We clearly need to work on some better definitions. Let's change the unit of account and see where it leads us. Let's use ounces of gold as our unit. It exists right there on the balance sheet, and so the Federal Reserve itself acknowledges that it is a collateral item. As such, we can use it as our unit of account and have a valid accounting. Before we do so, we need to take a look at the SDR line and figure out how much gold that's worth. After all, the International Monetary Fund has gold in its accounts that back the SDR. So just like the gold certificates of the Fed, we need to figure out how much gold backs the SDR. According to the IMF, there are 204 billion special drawing rights outstanding. Right now, each SDR carries a value of 1.38 Federal Reserve notes per SDR. So if we take all of the SDRs and multiply by 1.38, we find that they are equivalently worth about 282 billion Federal Reserve notes. Of these, the Fed holds 5.2 billion worth, which is roughly 1.8% of the total. Now, the IMF claims currently 90.5 million ounces of gold, so 1.8% of this is only 1.7 million ounces. It's a pretty small amount of gold backing the claims the Fed has on the IMF, but we need to go through that exercise. Now we're in a position to translate the Fed's collateral register to a gold-denominated accounting. First, we mark the gold to market by dividing the Federal Reserve notes outstanding by the recent spot gold price of 1,221 Federal Reserve notes to the ounce. This yields 1.358 billion ounces of gold. This is what the liability is currently worth if denominated in gold at current market prices. The gold certificates we can carry at their defined value of 261 million ounces of gold. We can take the SDR line and convert it to 1.7 million ounces of gold, which is almost inconsequential compared to the gold certificates. Adding the two rows up leaves us with 263 million ounces of gold backing a liability that is currently worth, according to market prices, 1.358 billion ounces of gold. So the tangible collateral is really just shy of 20% of the total obligation. Wait, you say, what about all those Treasury, agency, and mortgage-backed securities? You're right, they're not there. After all, how can debt that is denominated in the debt being collateralized serve as the collateral itself? Quite simply, it can't. That's just bad accounting. So let's just acknowledge what those items really represent on the collateral register. We now know that about 20% of the Federal Reserve notes are collateralized by something tangible, gold. That leaves about 80% of the obligation uncovered. It is backed by nothing more than the faith that the system will continue to function. Expressing it this way is a lot more honest, and it makes a lot more sense. The reality is that what we call the world reserve is really just a debt that has a 20% coverage of the true reserve, which is gold. Stop to think about that for a moment. There are 1.66 trillion Federal Reserve notes that serve as what the powers that be call the monetary base for the world. And at the same time, we have 5.77 billion ounces of above-ground gold that have been mined throughout history and have a market value of about 7 trillion Federal Reserve notes in total. That above-ground gold is held not only by central banks, but also by the population at large. The fact that gold carries such a value that is more than 4 times what the powers that be tell us is the total outstanding monetary base should tell you something about which is the real money. Let that sink in. Now, one of the reasons that I don't like using Federal Reserve notes as the unit of account has to do with the fact that its supply increases very quickly. True money should only increase in quantity very slowly. This is not the case with the Federal Reserve note. Let's take a look. Here I show the number of Federal Reserve notes as a function of time since Nixon closed the gold window in August of 1971. Notice that over the past 47 years, the quantity of notes has increased 28-fold. This is more than a 7% per year rate of increase. Recently, that increase has been just north of 5% per year, which is still quite high. How can we use something that is so variable as a measure of value? It's like measuring the length of a bridge with a string of rubber bands. It's just not practical. As you look at this graph, bear in mind it's on a logarithmic scale. The reason for doing this is to show the same percentage increase as the same distance on the graph. Using a logarithmic scale takes an exponential curve and turns it into a straight line. The slope of the line is the rate of growth. And the rate of growth in the supply of the Federal Reserve note has been quite high ever since Nixon closed the gold window. This increase in quantity, as I'll show you in a moment, is the reason why the Federal Reserve note has lost so much of its value relative to gold. As a side note, one might notice that the supply of Federal Reserve notes is still increasing, despite claims of quantitative tightening. A friend of mine and I figured out the mechanism they are calling quantitative tightening, but that's probably the subject for a different video. Suffice it to say, all of this quantitative tightening that they are claiming is not reducing the money supply. Frankly, it's not even slowing down its rate of growth. Now let's take a look at the purchasing power of the Federal Reserve note over time. As we've said, it's increased in quantity by over 7% per year for the past 47 years. Gold, by contrast, has increased in above-ground quantity by only 1.5 to 2% per year. Is it any surprise, then, that the Federal Reserve note now buys less gold than it did in the early 1970s? In 1971, 1,000 Federal Reserve notes would buy more than 22 ounces of gold. Today, 1,000 Federal Reserve notes won't even buy 1 full ounce of gold. So over the past 47 years, the Federal Reserve note has lost more than 96% of its purchasing power as measured in gold. Annualized, that's a 6.9% per year rate of decline. Sure, there have been periods when the Federal Reserve note strengthened in gold, but the long-term trend is down. Holding Federal Reserve notes is a losing proposition. One might choose to hold them indirectly by buying a debt instrument denominated in them, but even then, the interest paid barely made up for the loss of purchasing power that we've seen over the past 47 years. Let's go back to the whole collateral coverage issue and see if we can explain some of the periods of strength in the Federal Reserve note. Here's a chart showing to what extent the 261 million ounces of gold claimed by the Fed has collateralized its issued notes. I'm using the market value of those 261 million ounces and not the recorded book value. It's interesting that in 1971, the gold covered only 19% of the notes outstanding. At the time, this wasn't enough to persuade many of the other world governments to hold the notes, and so they were opting to convert the notes into gold. The U.S. Treasury was running out of gold, and so Nixon closed the gold window, ending the ability of foreign governments to convert notes to gold directly through the U.S. Treasury. so their only option was to trade their notes on the market for gold. The result was a scramble for world gold that devalued the dollar. A point was reached in the late 1970s where the value of the Federal Reserve note relative to gold resulted in the gold certificates held by the Fed having a true market value that was greater than the total number of Federal Reserve notes outstanding. The U.S. could have gone on to a 100% gold-backed reserve system during this period of time, but chose not to do so. When you think about these few years, it's really quite remarkable. It's similar to a scenario where a corporation trades on the market for less than the value of cash that it has. It's just not a situation that can logically persist for very long. When Fed Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to a sufficient level in order to protect the Federal Reserve note, it provided incentive for others to hold the Federal Reserve notes. They were essentially more than 100% backed by the claim on gold, plus they threw off interest well in excess of the rate of new note issuance. In other words, owning the Federal Reserve note at that time became a pretty good investment. As a result, over the following 10 years or so, the value of the Federal Reserve note relative to gold recovered quite a bit. Momentum and a declining interest rate environment took it the rest of the way until the early 2000s. Gold only covered about 12% of the outstanding Federal Reserve notes. The other 88% was simply misplaced confidence, and we saw how that worked out leading up to the year 2011. In 2011, we saw the gold coverage rise to a level of about 46%, and subsequently the coverage has declined somewhat. It's interesting to me that the trend has been gradually declining to a level of about 20%. While not nearly as low as the level that was reached in 2001, it's just as low as the level that started the 1970s dollar bear market. Oh, sorry, I said dollar. I meant Federal Reserve note market. Now, to me, this says that we shouldn't see much more strengthening in the Federal Reserve note relative to gold going forward from here. But just in case that you decide that you'd rather hold what the powers that be tell you is the world's money than the money that the Fed admits collateralizes the system, let me leave you with the following graph. As a very good friend of mine is fond of saying, get paid, buy gold. Gold, get you some.